Chapter 121, Oracle. Until they set out for the village, Lizzie had never imagined things would move this quickly. She collapsed onto the inn bed. Outside, it was already pitch black. It had been a long time since even the last passerby had disappeared from the streets. Tired, Hawan laid the child down on the other bed, then came over and sat beside her. The straw mattress sank beneath his weight, and Lizzie's body tilted, bumping against his leg. "You must be more tired than me. You've been in meetings this whole time." Lizzie forced her half-closed eyes open and looked up at him. Her husband smiled. She wriggled closer and rested her head on Hawan's thigh. Because of the awkward angle, her legs bent and her body was half suspended in the air. Hawan laughed softly, then pulled her up and held her properly. "Well, I'm fine. Back in the day, I used to work all night at the slightest excuse. This much is nothing." "Where exactly did you work?" "Some dark guild." Hawan only laughed quietly at Lizzie's words. The past few days after arriving in the village had been incredibly busy. Just organizing the subjugation force seemed to have been a major undertaking. Hawan had been swamped day after day with meetings and interviews. And now, at last, the preparations were complete. They would depart tomorrow. A guild employee had been assigned to accompany them as a guide. They had heard that basic meals would be provided once they reached the subjugation site. Apparently, several subjugation bases had already been set up. But food and supplies for the journey there had to be prepared individually. Lizzie and Hawan had stocked a considerable amount of food and various supplies in their carriage, but the other adventurers had been scrambling for the past few days to finish their preparations. Because so many people had rushed in at once, the shops that had been selling cheaper than others raised their prices, throwing things into even greater chaos. Fortunately, the guild contacted several shops, and it seemed the adventurers were able to purchase basic food and urgent supplies at a reasonable price. Even then, most of what they bought was only jerky, salt, and a little flour. The luggage carried by adventurers usually amounted to the clothes they wore in layers in a single backpack. Many did not even carry proper blankets, enduring the cold with only the clothes on their backs. Few people could travel as lightly as adventurers. Her eyes slowly drifted shut. "Half asleep?" Lizzie murmured. "We're living too luxuriously, aren't we? The food, the sleeping arrangements, everything keeps getting better. You spend more money on those things than anything else. With a woman and a child around, that much is only basic. You're just too generous to us." They still had not sold the hides they had brought from the mountain to the guild. When Hawan asked about the price, the chatterbox thought for quite a while before answering that the price would likely rise in the future. Lizzie had thought Hawan would not be interested in that sort of thing. But surprisingly, the moment he heard those words, he pulled back the bundle of hides he had been about to hand over. Remembering that moment, Lizzie laughed. The chatterbox had stared for a long time at the bundle of hides as it moved away again. From the look on his face, he probably wished he had never said the price would rise. He was an amusing person. Lizzie wrapped her arms around Hawan's waist. When she hugged him tightly, Hawan gently stroked her hair. Each time his hand softly brushed over her head, it felt so pleasant that her eyes slid shut. There were still a few things she needed to do, but she was too sleepy. She just wanted to fall asleep like this. "Ah, but I should get up." As those thoughts drifted back and forth, she seemed to have fallen asleep. Soft lips touched her cheek, and her husband's voice reached her. "Sleep well, Lizzie." Her body floated gently into the air, then sank back down onto the bed. It seemed Hawan had laid her properly beneath the blanket. Just before she fell completely into sleep, she heard Hawan leaving the room. Was he going to check the carriage supplies one more time? "I should help too." She thought that, but her head felt as heavy as wet cloth. Slowly, she slipped into sleep. At that same hour, the temple of the kingdom of Simone lay submerged in darkness. Most of the buildings had gone dark. But in one place, a small prayer room in the central temple, a dim light still burned. It was the prayer room of the high priestess, who was praised as being more beloved by God than any other in history. She had entered the temple at the age of 5, and was now 23. Having lived as a priestess for nearly 20 years, her daily life was an unbroken chain of prayers from morning until late night, and sometimes even until dawn. All of it was to hear the word of God. Yet in all that time, she had received an oracle only 3 times. Publicly, however, she was said to receive an oracle every year. Because the king desired it. The kingdom's internal situation had grown more difficult with each passing year. Long wars and drought, nobles and their subjects growing poorer and poorer, starving people. To soothe the growing resistance of both nobles and commoners, the king had used the temple for a long time. Somewhere, a rooster crowed. The sky was still dark, but dawn seemed close. The high priestess let out a small breath and rose. Today as well, she had failed to hear the word of God. When she left the prayer room, she noticed a faint light leaking out from the nearby library. It seemed some priest was studying inside. The high priestess was about to pass the library when she suddenly stopped. She thought she had heard a strange sound. Had she misheard? She listened carefully, but heard nothing. The high priestess began walking again. But then, something called to her. "Come, child, hear my words." This time, she heard it clearly. The voice was not unfamiliar. As if bewitched, the high priestess looked toward the library entrance. After taking only a few steps inside, a brilliant light suddenly poured into her mind. It was a strange sensation. It was not light she could see with her eyes. It felt as though her entire soul was being dazzled. The library, which should have been dark, shone as brightly as midday. At the center of that radiant light stood something whose shape was unclear. It had the form of a human, but it was enormous. A figure of light several times larger than an ordinary person stood before her. The high priestess hurriedly knelt. Above her bowed head, the light extended a hand, approaching as if to gently caress her. "Child of our God, our poor child, the time has come to end your long suffering. The hero sent by our God has already descended upon that land. Welcome him. The hero shall save your withered hearts and your withered land." Ordinary oracles were difficult to understand. They were made of vague words, leaving their meaning uncertain. But this oracle was like lightning, powerful and unmistakably clear. A blinding radiance flashed through the high priestess's mind. For an instant, she felt as if she had gone blind. Her vision turned pure white. She could see nothing. When she came to her senses, she was still kneeling blankly, staring into empty air. "Priestess! High priestess! Are you all right?" She heard a priest's voice. When she turned her head, she saw a young priest who had not yet fully shed the look of a boy staring at her worriedly. Behind the young priest stood an old man whose hair and beard had gone completely white. He was the one responsible for teaching the children who entered the temple. I received God. It was not a simple oracle. It appeared so. Did you see it too, elder priest? No. What I saw was only you. But I knew. I understood instinctively. God was here. The elder priest looked at her with narrowed eyes, as if he were gazing at something dazzling, then turned his head to the side. "You, hurry and inform the priests. I will go call the head priest." The elder priest held out his hand to her. "High priestess, let us go. Receiving God is not a matter for the temple alone." At the elder priest's words, the high priestess seemed to come back to herself and stood. That was right. She had to make God's words known to the world. Drought, war, and hunger had tormented the entire kingdom for a long time. The commoners suffered the most, but that did not mean the nobles lived comfortably. Aside from a select few, the nobles too had lost relatives during the long wars, and their territories had fallen into ruin. Their suffering was the same. These were painful times for everyone. And through all that suffering, many people had begun to despair because God gave no answer. They had to inform everyone as quickly as possible. As she hurried down the dark corridor with the elder priest, almost running, emotion swelled in the high priestess's chest. At last, a hero has appeared in our kingdom as well. A hero sent by God. A hero was a being summoned when humans desperately prayed to God. Many preparations were necessary, but the most important factor was God's permission. No matter how perfectly the preparations were made, if God did not allow it, the hero would not be summoned. That was why everyone had grown anxious upon hearing that a hero had been summoned in the kingdom of Tyrone. God had sent a hero to their enemy, but not to their kingdom. Then had God abandoned them? That fear had spread not only among the common people, but even among the priests and priestesses. To dispel that atmosphere, the king had even spread rumors that perhaps a hero had already descended upon their land, but it was useless. Despair was spreading across the entire country. But God has not abandoned us. A hero was hope. A hero became the center that gathered people's hearts and strength together. A hero would become the power that allowed them to endure these dark, painful times. Her heart swelled, and tears began to gather in her eyes. This hero seems entirely different from the ones before, the elder priest suddenly murmured. Yes. He certainly is. Because he is someone God sent directly. The high priestess nodded firmly. Meeting the king required many procedures and a great deal of time. But this time, as soon as dawn broke, an audience was granted. Together with the head priest, the high priestess headed toward the splendid audience chamber of the royal palace. Normally, a priestess did not meet the king directly. There were rare occasions when she saw him in person, but even then, she only glimpsed him from a great distance. For a priestess, keeping her soul pure to receive God was important. Contact with other people was kept to the minimum, and she spent nearly all her life within the temple. But this was not a simple oracle. There had been the king's request, but the head priest also seemed to believe it was better for her to report it directly. When the attendant's announcement rang out, declaring the king's arrival, the high priestess bowed her head in slight nervousness. Once the king gave permission for her to raise her head, she lifted it a little. The king looked much older than when she had seen him before. She had only glimpsed him from a distance, so she could not be certain, but he seemed gaunt. She wondered if he might be ill. It was only intuition, but she was probably right. Her instincts were usually accurate. But she was not in a position to say such a thing, and perhaps he already knew. If it was something being hidden, there was no need for her to stir it up needlessly. The high priestess waited until the head priest finished making his report to the king. And finally, after the king gave her permission to relay God's words directly, she opened her mouth. Not a word more, not a word less. Exactly the same. God's words must not be distorted. The king listened silently. One more time. At that command, the high priestess relayed the exact same words to the king again. I see. As expected. The king spoke as if relieved, then laughed quietly. It seems our hero mistakenly fell into the enemy kingdom. Fortunately, late last night, word arrived that he had departed from Tyrone's royal palace. As soon as the king finished speaking, the attendant beside him opened his mouth. For events to align so perfectly truly, she is the greatest priestess in our kingdom. The attendant began by appearing to praise the high priestess, then continued by telling the head priest several of the king's instructions, saying that this matter had to be widely announced to the people. It all seemed prepared in advance. They were to inform temples across the entire kingdom of the hero's appearance. They were to explain to the people that, through the king's tireless efforts, he had pulled the hero from the enemy's grasp. And more besides. The head priest listened quietly to the attendant's words. Perhaps he intended to obey exactly as instructed. But no. That is not true. Before she realized it, the high priestess had stepped forward and spoken. The eyes of the king, the attendant, and the head priest all turned toward her. "Forgive me, your majesty. But the hero is already in this land. He is not in another country." The king's gaze sharpened. A vein stood out on his forehead. The high priestess shrank back, but this was something she had to say. God had clearly said the hero had descended upon this land. He had not said the hero was somewhere else. She tried to explain that, but the head priest seized her arm firmly. "Forgive us, your majesty. This priestess entered the temple at the age of 5 and has lived almost entirely within its walls ever since. She is a child who has listened only to God's words, a pure soul who knows nothing of the world. Please forgive her." The king frowned and waved his hand lightly. As a priestess who has done nothing but relay God's words, it is possible she does not understand the world. Today is a good day, so I shall forgive her. But from now on, she would do well to watch her tongue. "Of course, your majesty. This will not happen again. We thank you for your generous mercy." The high priestess could not say another word before she withdrew from the audience chamber. As she walked down the corridor with her wrist held by the head priest, she shook her head. "Head priest, no. That is wrong. Quiet. There are many eyes here." The head priest's tone was so stern that the high priestess could say nothing more. Only once they were inside the carriage returning to the temple was she finally able to speak. God's words were not like that. This time, there was not even room for a different interpretation. "I know. But it cannot be done." After saying that, the head priest placed a hand on her head. If it had been before the king obtained a hero, perhaps things would be different. But His Majesty has already obtained a hero through his own power. In that situation, telling people that another hero has appeared would be the same as asking them to kill the true hero, the hero God sent to us. But, he is the hero God sent. If another person is announced as the hero, it is fine. The head priest smiled faintly. "You do not know this, but in truth, a summoned hero is merely a person from another world whom we humans called here by borrowing God's power because we desired it. They are only people with great strength." "What? This is something known only to high-ranking priests. If ordinary people learned of it, it would only cause confusion, and that is why it is not spoken of. The reason His Majesty treats heroes as nothing especially sacred is because he understands the nature of summoning better than anyone. But I truly heard God's words." As the high priestess spoke with a confused expression, the head priest quietly looked at her face. "I know that you truly met God. I do not think it was a lie. But that is why it will be all right. No matter how much the king presents another hero as the real one, that person will not become our hero. If he is a hero sent directly by God, then he is not merely a person from another world. He is God's messenger. When the time comes, everyone will know. So do not worry." She did not understand. Was the head priest not simply tolerating and accepting a lie? It was filthy. The head priest chuckled softly and turned his gaze out the window. "You may remain as you are. There is no need for you to be stained by the world. It is enough for a few of us to become dirty." After that, there was no conversation. Only one sentence, murmured quietly by the head priest. Perhaps even this is part of God's arrangement. After returning to the temple, the high priestess went straight to the prayer room. The guilt of having allowed God's words to be defiled seemed to crush her heart. Collapsing onto the floor as if she were crumbling, the high priestess begged God for forgiveness. But no matter how many times she prayed, dozens, hundreds of times, God's words did not descend again. Only the usual time of prayer returned, just as it always had. Chapter 122, Meeting the Margrave. The road to the area where the magical beasts had reportedly appeared was far from smooth. Sometimes the carriage wheels sank into the mud and refused to budge. Other times, the adventurers' feet sank deep with every step. Whenever their shoes were caught by the muck, walking took just a little more effort than it would on solid ground. They said small grains of dust could pile into a mountain, and apparently the same was true in the worst possible way. The adventurers were already exhausted from walking all day, and their bodies were steadily wearing down. Just when they finally seemed to leave that kind of road behind, the carriage began to shake violently instead. If it's not mud, it's stone. When are we going to get a normal road? Maybe a landslide had come through here before, or maybe the road had always been like this, but the ground felt like a path made of loose gravel. They had already been traveling over it for more than half a day. A sigh slipped out of him before he realized it. While paying attention to the carriage's jolting, Hawan leaned slightly toward the gap behind the driver's seat and peeked inside. With all the windows shut, there was little sunlight inside the carriage. In the dimness, he could faintly see two figures lying on the straw beds. Fortunately, despite how badly the carriage was rattling, the beds themselves did not seem to be shaking as much as he had feared. Lizzie and Dorothy were sleeping soundly. They looked really tired, so that's a relief. It was true that the two of them had gotten used to traveling by carriage, but until now, they had always chosen decent roads. They had also taken plenty of breaks so the journey would not be too hard on them. They had never been forced to keep marching without rest over roads where wheels sank into mud or over ground this uneven. In the end, the bright smiles they had worn when they first set out had turned pale in no time. They had probably suffered badly from motion sickness too. In less than half a day, Lizzie and Dorothy had gone back and forth between lying down and throwing up until they eventually fell asleep. Thanks to Hawan using healing magic several times, their motion sickness seemed to have eased a little. But healing magic, which could treat cuts, puncture wounds, and even burns, was not especially effective against something as light as motion sickness. He had thought it would be able to get rid of it easily, but that had not been the case. It only lessened the symptoms a little. I thought something like motion sickness would be nothing. Magic was strange in some ways. Or maybe not. Earth's medicine might be the same. Humanity still had not conquered something as simple as the common cold. The medicine prescribed when people caught a cold treated the symptoms, not the cold itself. Mankind still had not conquered the cold. Even though it was such a common illness, one that seemed so simple. Hawan let out a quiet sigh. While he was thinking about motion sickness and colds, it seemed another fight had broken out among the adventurers walking up ahead. Yunhui, let's go a little faster. Hawan gave a slight tug on the reins as a signal. When Yunhui began walking with light, tapping steps, the carriage shook hard as it moved past the others and headed forward. Woohoo! Kill him! Show them what we're made of! A loud commotion rose from the place where people had gathered. The adventurers had looked half dead from exhaustion until just a moment ago, but whenever a fight broke out, they suddenly became lively again. That probably was not actually the case, but seeing them like this made it feel as though they had been exaggerating their fatigue. Since people had gathered from many different places, groups had naturally formed among the adventurers based on their regions of origin. Hawan had learned that while interviewing them to form the subjugation force. In the end, he had thought it would be better to divide them mostly by region, since that would make it easier for them to cooperate at least a little. As a result, they had grown friendlier with one another and developed a stronger sense of belonging, which was good. But another problem had appeared. They began taking sides and fighting over trivial things. When there was a large difference in skill, the weaker side simply avoided the fight. There was no contest. But when their abilities were similar, they drew weapons first. Adventurers seemed far more hot-blooded than even the roughest men in the villages. It would have been fine if the people around them stopped the parties involved from fighting. Instead, they cheered for the adventurers from their own regions and sometimes even placed bets, which made everything worse. At first, Hawan had tried to resolve things peacefully by persuading them with words, calming them down, and pulling them apart. But now, when Hawan approached the noisy crowd, he leaped down from the carriage. The moment he appeared, the crowd parted like the Red Sea before Moses. In an instant, the people vanished from the center of the fight, forming a long path. Hawan could now see 3 adventurers who had just started swinging their weapons. It looked like 2 of them were fighting against 1. Hawan walked toward them with steady steps. As he neared the center, he clenched his fist. Wind gathered around the edge of his large fist. Before the 3 fighting adventurers could even properly react to seeing him, his fist shot toward the one closest to him. With a heavy thud, the man toppled forward. Watching from the corner of his eye to make sure the fallen man got back up, Hawan immediately swung his fist at the next person. Before his fist even reached him, the wind struck the opponent first. If Hawan's actual fist had landed, that would have been one thing. But this was only a blow from a strong gust of wind. He had controlled his strength, so there was no danger of death. After seeing the second adventurer collapse to the ground, Hawan turned toward the last one. The third adventurer had already dropped his weapon. He raised both hands into the air and shouted, "Stop! I'm done. It's over. No. Whatever the situation is, things have to be fair. I asked you so many times not to fight, and yet you still drew weapons. That means all 3 of you share responsibility." After saying that, Hawan swung his fist through the air. The man screamed and flew backward. Cheers erupted from the crowd. "Whoa! We won! Pay up! Ah, damn it! That was too fast!" Apparently, whether Hawan came to stop the fight had also been included in their bets. "Stop that!" When Hawan frowned, the adventurers burst into laughter. One adventurer, who was collecting money from the others, grinned. "Ah, sorry about that. But the first guy who went down was bragging, you know. He said he'd never go down in one hit." Someone grumbled from the back. "Seriously? At this rate, betting won't even work anymore. Everyone goes down in one hit, so who's going to bet on the other side?" The one who wanted to sigh and say seriously was Hawan. He let out a breath and turned away. At first, Hawan had tried to stop every fight by pulling people apart. He had soothed them with kind words, stepped between them to mediate, and listened to why the fight had started. But there was no end to it. As soon as he stopped one fight and turned around, another broke out somewhere else. Sometimes, the very person who had just fought started fighting again. If he stopped the procession every time that happened, they would not reach the site even after a month. In the end, whenever someone started fighting, he simply beat all of them down. It did not stop the procession, and after trying it, he realized it was the fastest method. The guild guide, who was riding on horseback, approached Hawan as he climbed back onto the carriage. "You're having a hard time. But adventurers are originally like that. Rough, simple, and pleasure-seeking. If there's something fun in the moment, they enjoy it and move on. Death is always beside adventurers, so they never miss a chance to enjoy themselves." The guide gave a bitter smile and glanced at the adventurers, who had scattered again and resumed walking. "We're almost there. We'll arrive at the first subjugation base soon." "Have they found the magical beast?" The guide had occasionally received messages sent by the guild. Perhaps there was new information. "No, not yet. But they say the first subjugation unit found traces. It's been a while since we received that message, so I don't know what things are like now." The guide grinned. "It seems everyone at the guild is making a fuss because this was unexpected. Nobody thought Mr. Hawan, who was like a lone wolf, would lead people this well. No, this was not really leadership. Anyone who had worked in a company could do this much. They did not even need to have worked in a company. Anyone who had graduated middle school or high school could manage this." "Ah, right. They don't have that here. I guess there are a lot of people who've never experienced group life." The guide shrugged. "Chatterbox was anxious even after asking you to do this. He knew that even though you look a little intimidating, you're actually fairly soft-hearted. He wondered if this kind of thing might not suit you. Was that in the Red Sword Party's report? Hawan had thought the first guide assigned to an adventurer was simply someone who taught them how to survive as an adventurer, but apparently they also served as a kind of background investigator. The guild did not ask adventurers what they had done before or what kind of personality they had. Unless someone was a wanted criminal with a bounty, the guild accepted people without asking questions. Instead, it seemed they placed a guide beside them and roughly assessed their tendencies that way. Well, from an organization's point of view, it would definitely be unsettling to know nothing at all. The guide glanced cautiously at Hawan. You're not angry? No. Haha. Mr. Hawan, you really are a little strange. When people hear something like this, there are usually two reactions. One is to get furious. The other is to accept it. Of course. There were only two possible reactions. There are two kinds of people who accept it, too. One kind doesn't understand it at all. They don't know what that kind of report means. So they don't get angry. Because they don't understand. On the other hand, people who do understand what it means usually accept it in a resigned way. Like, that's just how the world works. It's similar to how commoners can't do anything against nobles. But you feel different, Mr. Hawan. How should I put it? It's like you understand why it's necessary. Yes, that's it. You're just like a guild master. That was because after working in a company for a few years, a person had superiors above them and subordinates below them. Naturally, after experiencing both sides, they came to understand both positions to some degree. They continued driving the carriage while chatting idly for a while. Then the guide looked into the distance and spoke. We're here. That's the first subjugation base. It's the first place where the magical beast was spotted. Hawan looked at the village in the distance. It was small and shabby. It had a wooden fence, but many parts were broken or collapsed. It looked much like the other villages. Is this the village of that man and his child? He remembered the face of the man he had met on the way to the guild, the one who had repeatedly said he would not sell his son. The man who had cried, saying his whole family was dead. As Hawan narrowed his eyes and looked closer, he spotted human figures inside the village. His expression tightened slightly as he watched them. He had thought they were a subjugation unit, but they were not. Those are soldiers. Hey! The guide seemed not to have known either. He stared at the village for a moment, then sighed. It seems the Margrave is here. The Margrave? Isn't he a high noble? There seem to be too few soldiers for someone like that to move personally. At Hawan's words, the guide grinned. Our lord is a soldier down to his bones. In the past, the entire Margraviate of Bern was a battlefield several times over. Since small wars are almost always breaking out near the border, the lord's family has been like that for generations. That's why he doesn't travel with a long line of attendants like the central nobles. Sometimes he only brings a few people with him to track enemy soldiers or magical beasts. As the subjugation force drew closer to the village, the other side seemed to notice them as well. From inside the village, a man on a large horse came riding toward them. His hair was white, but he had a very sturdy build. Behind him, several mounted soldiers hurriedly followed. Underscore 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 un. The guide let out a startled sound and immediately jumped down from his horse. The other adventurers also stopped walking and began murmuring among themselves. So that man is the Margrave. Hawan got down from the carriage. Judging by the others' reactions, even if nobles could not carelessly lay hands on adventurers, the difference in status clearly existed. When the Margrave came closer, several adventurers dropped flat to the ground. Most of the others bowed deeply. The Margrave rode hard and came straight to a stop in front of Hawan, then pulled his horse's head back. The horse gave a sharp cry and stopped in place. It seemed well trained. A low voice came down from above Hwan's head. "Are you the healing mage? The upper-tier adventurer?" Hwan had heard that nobles had their own etiquette. That supposedly applied to speech as well, but this Margrave seemed to be the type to throw all that away and get straight to the point. He was like an adventurer who happened to speak politely. Keeping his head lowered, Hwan answered. "Yes. My name is Hwan. Would you consider working under me? I will treat you with the highest regard. I know an upper-tier adventurer recognized by the guild is something special. I will give you treatment worthy of that." The answer was already decided. What Hwan wanted was not wealth or glory, but a simple life spent with his family. If he could live the same ordinary days, gather with his family in the evening, laugh, and talk together, he had nothing more to wish for. Hwan quietly opened his mouth. Chapter 123, The Name of the Margrave of Bern. If I could serve under the Lord Margrave, it would truly be a great honor. To become the sword of the family that protects this land is an honorable duty anyone would long for. However, I am only a simple man. Rather than living a life of honor, my wish is to live quietly with my wife and daughter. Hwan had his head lowered, so he could not see the Margrave's face. However, because he was using wind magic to sense his surroundings, he could grasp the Margrave's movements as clearly as if they were in his hand. The closer something was, the more precisely mana detection could read it. Whatever the Margrave did, Hwan would know in an instant. That was why he could feel mana swelling inside the Margrave's body right now. He was probably just about to attack. Mana had gathered in the Margrave's arm. He was strong. This Margrave was probably strong. In terms of mana, he likely could not compare to Hwan. That was not arrogance. There was no one with more mana than Hwan, or even as much as him. But this man possessed a different kind of strength from mana. It was probably something like the presence of an immortal warrior on the battlefield. Back on Earth, when Hwan had gone up against gangsters, he had once met a man who gave off that same feeling. He had been the boss of a famous group with one foot in Seoul's nightlife district. When Hwan clashed with him, he had been beaten terribly. He had barely managed to force a draw, but if even one of that man's subordinates had joined in, losing would have been the least of his worries. He probably would have died. The only reason he survived was because that gangster boss forbade them from interfering. Hwan felt that same strength from this Margrave. It was not because of mana. It was probably because of his spirit. An overwhelming confidence supported the Margrave from behind. Hwan filled his fingertips, shoulders, arms, every part of his body with mana. But he suppressed it as much as possible so it would not leak outside. The Margrave probably did not even know Hwan was gathering mana. No, perhaps he could sense it by instinct. His skin tingled as if it might burst open at any moment. Holding his breath down, Hwan breathed quietly and steadily. Thump! Thump! His heart beat slowly. It's fine. No matter what happens, I can react. Back at the inn, he had already asked Ounce and Yunhui to protect Lizzie and Dorothy. Ounce would not leave Dorothy's side, and Yunhui would not leave Lizzie's. Even if the Margrave's subordinates attacked, or if the Margrave targeted Lizzie and Dorothy instead of Hwan, Ounce and Yunhui would definitely respond. Hwan only had to fight properly in order to protect them. His tension rose until he could feel his blood pulsing through his veins. Then, at some point, the Margrave's body moved as if a taut string had snapped. The mana gathered in the Margrave's hand shot toward Hwan. A whip-like gust of wind lashed toward Hwan's head. As short screams burst out around him, Hwan released the mana trapped inside his body. Without moving, mana spread outward from him in every direction. Bang! As their mana collided, a tremendous sound rang out. Mana pushed against mana. The air between the two of them exploded outward in all directions. Someone screamed and was blown away. Most of the people nearby had probably been hit by the shock. But only then did Hawan relax. Yunhui and Ounce had not reacted at all. That meant the Margrave had held no killing intent. If the Margrave had intended to kill Hawan even slightly, Yunhui would have killed him immediately. She definitely would have. Even now, Yunhui was staring straight in this direction without moving an inch. If that had happened, they would probably have had no choice but to hide deep in the mountains, living without knowing what would happen next. Thank goodness! Ha! I really can relax now. A little strength left Hawan's waist. At that moment, the Margrave's laughter rang out above his head. The Margrave laughed shortly in a low voice, then opened his mouth. Looks like you're not just an idiot with a lot of mana. You have skill and nerve, of course, but also patience and judgment. You would have made a fine soldier. The Margrave turned his horse and glanced at Yunhui. It is well known that the Adventurers Guild reveres those of Santa rank. In our territory, we maintain a good relationship with the guild. I have no intention of trying to force a Santa rank adventurer to do anything. When Hawan raised his head, the Margrave gave a quiet laugh. From now on, you will become entangled with many nobles. I was the first to learn that a Santa rank had appeared, but the news will soon begin spreading elsewhere. Once that happens, many troublesome matters will follow. When that time comes, use my name. Without any price or pressure attached, I will lend you the name of Byrne. Before Hawan even had time to answer, the Margrave left. It seemed he had come simply to see Hawan for himself. The Margrave and his subordinates did not enter the town. They rode across the rough land and gradually grew farther away. What was that? Hawan had been extremely tense, so now he felt a little dumbfounded. If Yunhui or Ounce had killed the Margrave, it would have become a disaster. But if he had simply wanted to confirm what kind of person Hawan was. Is that Margrave an idiot? The guide came closer and let out a deep breath. Ha, seriously, I thought my heart was going to stop. Of course, I didn't think the Lord Margrave was stupid enough to use force for real, but that still scared me. The guide smiled with a pale face. The Margraviate of Byrne is so wide and vast, and so many monsters appear here, that we cannot function without the Adventurers Guild. Managing the territory with soldiers alone would be impossible. Besides, although the Lord Margrave does act unpredictably like he did just now, he is one of the better ones. He does cut people's heads off without hesitation, but he doesn't kill without reason. Was that supposed to make him one of the better ones? Hawan's face must have looked sour. The guide spoke again. Among nobles, there are sometimes those who kill their subjects simply because they are in a bad mood. There are also many lords who raise taxes to live luxuriously while their people starve. But the Lord Margrave does not do such terrible things. Taxes are heavy because of military expenses, but he does not torment his people for his own luxury. For a noble, he is one of the better ones. But his subordinates must suffer a lot. If he keeps rushing around like that. Haha. Well, yes. And they say his temper is a little fiery too. He did not sound like a good person at all. If that was enough to earn him such a favorable evaluation, then it seemed every other noble was complete trash. I'll have to be careful when going to other territories. Haha. It's not as though all nobles are that bad. The guide said that with a laugh, but Hawan could not laugh, or even smile. If they had accidentally killed the Margrave, his life would have gone straight down into ruin. Several adventurers who had been blown away by the aftermath of Hawan and the Margrave's mana collision were groaning. The others had already sprung back to their feet, but a few seemed to have been hurt a little when they fell. One person seemed to have injured his back and was lying on the ground, whining. If he hurt his back, that's a serious injury. Without anyone noticing, Hawan quietly let a little healing magic flow out. Just a tiny amount. Only enough to barely heal him. But the adventurer with the injured back continued to whimper. It should not hurt that much now, so he seemed to be the type who exaggerated his pain. Hawan stared at the man's face in disbelief, then suddenly turned his gaze toward the carriage. Ounce was crying softly. Pi. Pi. Thump 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 thump. Lizzie's heart was beating so quickly that when she put a hand to her chest, it felt as though her skin was fluttering. Before they left this place, Hawan had made them promise him one thing. He had made both Lizzie and Dorothy swear that they would absolutely never break it. No matter what happened, they were never to leave Ounce and Yunhui's side. Lizzie knew what those words meant. It meant that even if Hawan fell into danger, she was not to rush out thoughtlessly to save him. It probably also meant that if he died, she should ride away on Yunhui and escape. Even while saying that such a thing would never happen, Hawan decided in advance what they should do in the worst-case scenario. For some reason, that looked terribly sad to her. It was as if he were speaking like someone who had only ever suffered tragedies. Hawan did not talk about himself much, so she did not know what kind of life he had lived. But if he had not even known where his parents were buried until now, perhaps he had lived an incredibly sorrowful life. That was why she thought that, even in the worst-case scenario, she must not die in front of him. Whatever happened after Hawan died, at the very least, she must not give him that kind of grief. But people could not always act according to what they thought. The moment she thought Hawan was in danger because of the Margrave, her body tried to rush outside on its own. This was different from when he had fought other men. Their opponent was a great noble. No matter how strong Hawan was, he would die. Once she thought that, even though she knew she would be no help at all, and even though she knew she would only get in the way, her mind seemed to freeze. The only thoughts left in her head were that she had to go to Hawan's side, and that Hawan was in danger. The only reason she had not rushed out of the carriage was because Dorothy suddenly collapsed. If that had not happened, she would have run out. And then she might have been injured by the mana explosion that occurred between Hawan and the Margrave, just like the adventurers lying near Hawan now. I'm glad I didn't. But when would Dorothy wake up? She was a little worried. Not very worried. Just a little. Only a tiny bit worried. After all, the one who had done this to Dorothy was none other than Yunhui. When the Margrave and Hawan met earlier, Dorothy had woken up at almost the same time as Lizzie. When they were in the mountains, Dorothy had trained every day with Ounce on her own. When Dorothy gave an order, Ounce would bend or break something. At first it had only been things like leaves, but later he had even become able to bend tree branches and thin pieces of metal. Perhaps those experiences had given the child confidence. Or perhaps she had realized that this time was different from when they had dealt with other adventurers or townspeople. Dorothy seemed to think that if her father was in danger, she could save him. In the past, she had only been afraid, but now she believed she had the power to help. Fearlessly, Dorothy tried to rush out while giving Ounce an order. Even Ounce tried to go with her, which truly startled Lizzie. At that moment, somehow, Yunhui knew and put Dorothy to sleep. Lizzie did not know whether Yunhui had been watching what was happening inside the carriage the whole time, or whether Ounce and Yunhui were connected somehow. It was strange, since Yunhui should not have been able to see inside the carriage. But judging by the small red pattern glowing on Dorothy's forehead, it had definitely been Yunhui. Ounce had been startled when he saw it, then stopped just as he was about to run out. Lizzie gently pressed her ear to Dorothy's chest. Thump, thump. The small heart was beating, and occasionally sleep talk slipped from her mouth. Perhaps she was having a happy dream. Maybe Yunhui had deliberately made her dream something pleasant. Rudolphs really did seem like magical children. Dorothy's eyelids twitched, and she smiled faintly in her sleep. Yes. That was why Lizzie was not truly worried. Beside her, Ounce cried Pi-I, Pi-I. Maybe he was telling her not to worry. Or maybe he was worried too. Or perhaps he was reflecting on the fact that he had nearly chased after the child and rushed outside. It's okay. After saying that to Ounce, Lizzie pressed her ear to the child's chest once more. Then the carriage door swung open. Hawan stood there, looking inside with bright light behind him. What happened? Hawan's eyes caught on Dorothy. Ah! He was worried. Lizzie quickly explained the situation. There was a red pattern on her forehead. Judging by the fact that she was sleep-talking, she seemed to be asleep. As Lizzie gave that disjointed explanation, Hawan quickly placed his hand on the child's body. It seemed he was trying to use healing magic. A moment later, Hawan let out a relieved breath and muttered. Seriously? It's good that she listened, but doing it like this? I thought my heart was going to stop. He must have been talking about Yunhui. Because Hawan spoke so normally, it seemed a little strange. The Margrave was an incredibly high-ranking person. To a commoner like Lizzie, he was someone who lived above the clouds, someone she might never see once in her entire life. He had eyes, a nose, a mouth, arms, and legs just like anyone else, but he felt like an entirely different being. Long ago, her father had said he had heard a rumor that gold came out when nobles took a shit. In remote villages, there were people who half-doubted such things but still believed them. Now, Lizzie knew that was not true. But even so, she had once thought that perhaps their bodies really did contain something different from hers. Mages and nobles, she did not know exactly how they were different. But she had thought that, in any case, they were completely different beings from commoners like herself. Hawan had seen such a person right in front of him, spoken with him, and even clashed against him with Mana. Was he really all right? Perhaps Lizzie's face looked too serious, because Hawan suddenly smiled. Lizzie, your face looks scary. Are you all right? I'm all right. After saying that, Hawan hugged Lizzie and Dorothy, then smiled faintly again. His voice came quietly, barely audible. Actually, I was a little scared. I was really scared too. When Lizzie said that, Hawan looked softly at Dorothy's sleeping face. Was Dorothy the only brave one? Maybe she really had been. Remembering Dorothy's face as she tried to rush out, saying she would save her father, Lizzie lightly rested her head against Hawan's chest. My heart isn't going to survive this. Ha! Mine either. Children forgot things the moment you turned your back, no matter how seriously you made them promise. Though this time, Lizzie had no right to say anything either. Together, the two of them let out another long sigh. Chapter 124, Mother and Child. Will this be all right? What if he abuses the name of Bern? At his aide's question, the Margrave of Bern gave a dismissive snort. Where are your eyes? That man openly defied even my offer. He is not the sort of person who would use Bern's name for anything strange. But... enough. It's already decided. Hurry and send him clothing bearing our family crest. Include women's accessories and items for a child as well. If the purpose is to show that he may use our name, would clothing for the man alone not be enough? Garments bearing the crest are limited to only a select few, such as the head of the family and the heir. The aide added anxiously. Even giving it to that man alone is excessive. The Margrave of Bern grinned. A man like that cannot be hooked with money or status. He is the type who repays sincerity with sincerity. And what matters most to him is his family. It was exactly as Kyle reported. He puts his family first. The Margrave of Bern lightly jumped down from his horse and handed the reins to a soldier. That is exactly why we must pay attention to the child and the woman. Just as I place the protection of this territory above all else, that man values his family's safety and well-being above anything. So it cannot be only him who receives protection from other nobles. He likely would not feel the slightest bit grateful for that much. He said that to his aide, but the man still seemed dissatisfied. Well, I can understand the aide's thoughts well enough. A family crest was special. The same was true for objects and accessories, but those allowed to wear clothing embroidered with that crest were especially limited. Even the wife of the family head could not wear such garments carelessly. There was only one reason for someone who was neither the family head nor the heir to wear such clothing. It meant that mistreating the person wearing it was an insult to the family name, and that all of Bern would not stand idle. It was not something to be given to just anyone. The Margrave gave a small shrug and looked at the tents spread out before him. Near the border, rows of soldiers' tents stood in formation. Between the tents, the commander in charge of this place approached. "You have arrived, sir. What are the enemy's movements?" "No changes. They are quiet enough to be unpleasant." The Margrave gave a short nod, signaling him to withdraw, then strode forward with heavy steps. As he entered the large tent, he swept off the coat he had been wearing and tossed it to his aide. Watching the aide quickly catch and fold the garment, the Margrave flopped down onto the simple bed. As he grew older, his stamina was being worn away little by little. In the past, he could stay awake for several days and still be perfectly fine. Now, if he went a single day without sleep while moving around, he became this tired the next day. But he could not rest. Even before the magic beast appeared, the movements of the Tyrone soldiers near the border had become somewhat suspicious. This position had been established to keep watch over them. The gradually increasing number of troops. The bizarre magic beast that suddenly appeared. This is definitely their doing. At first, he had simply thought the magic beast had come down toward the villages because of hunger. But that magic beast had been different from others. Its appearance was far too bizarre. Almost as if the Margrave of Bern closed his eyes. He did not know what they had done to drive a magic beast to this side, but it was certainly the work of those Tyrone bastards. As soon as he realized that, the Margrave immediately placed a request with the guild. He could leave the magic beast to the guild. What he needed to focus on was not the beast, but the enemy. His instincts told him so. This was one of their schemes. He must not let his attention be drawn to the magic beast and leave the border defenses full of holes. Perhaps because he had immediately raised the flag at the border and built up a camp to put on a show of force, the enemy had shown no movement at all. That man named Hawan. If he cooperated with our side, nothing could be better. The Margrave grinned as he remembered the moment he had clashed with Hawan. It had been a long time since he felt that kind of tension. It reminded him of the thrill he had faced several times in his younger days, back when he had recklessly thrown himself into danger. It felt like I had one foot in death. Had he pushed that man even a little further, he would likely have collapsed on the spot, bleeding. It was like being cut by invisible blades. When he recalled the mana that had surrounded Hawan's entire body, a chill ran down his spine. It had felt as if blades of wind were aiming for his neck from every direction. It had truly been chilling. Now that he had so many things he could not afford to lose, it was a thrill he should no longer be feeling. Lying there with his arms crossed, the Margrave forced himself to seek sleep. A soldier had to be able to fall asleep within minutes no matter where he was. On a battlefield, where no one knew when the enemy might attack, being able to sleep and wake easily seemed like a small matter, but it was tremendously important. Yet it had been so long since his blood had boiled like this that sleep did not come easily. The Margrave pictured Hawan's face in his mind. I would like to cross blades with that man at least once. Hawan possessed more abundant mana, and his talent for magic might be incomparable to his own. But the Margrave had long experience. In a duel where lives were on the line, the conclusion was determined by every tiny habit, by experience, and even by luck. It was not decided simply by who had more mana or who knew more kinds of magic. He was a noble, but he did not use the polished swordsmanship of clean, decorative nobles. He had used tricks, of course, and if necessary, he had even thrown sand into an opponent's eyes. Other nobles would raise their voices and condemn such methods as cowardly, but on the battlefield, survival was justice. That was the resolve and behavior he demanded not only from himself, but from his soldiers as well. No matter what, survive. That was the conclusion his ancestors had reached after losing countless relatives on the battlefield. Unable to sleep because of the excitement and thrill that seemed to make his body ache, the Margrave began counting numbers. He was scheduled to make a round of the border that evening. He had to sleep now. Hawan. I look forward to the next time we meet. He had aged enough that his body was growing old, but his heart was still young. Feeling a faint ache in his knee, the Margrave let out a small sigh. It seemed it would rain tonight. The subjugation base was called a base, but in reality it was only a few houses stocked with food and a small number of supplies. Of course, they were not soldiers. It was only a handful of guild employees staying there, so there was no reason they would have built a proper camp. Hawan knew that. He had known it, but he had not expected it to be this shabby, just a few plain houses. There don't seem to be any tools here that could be used to catch a magic beast. At Hawan's words, the guild employee laughed awkwardly. Well, we do at least have nets prepared. Nets, hey. If something like a net could catch it, the subjugation would have been completed already. Hawan let out a small breath and sat on the table inside the house. There were a few chairs, but they were all piled with things. The only places to sit were the floor or the table, and the floor was filthy with bits of leather, excrement, and what looked like rat droppings. Perhaps because only men had gathered here, no one seemed to have any intention of cleaning it. Of course, Hawan did not either. It seemed better to have Lizzie and Dorothy stay in the carriage. Being outside would be cleaner and more hygienic. Definitely. Hawan took the wooden slips and papers the guild employee handed him and read through them one by one. They were records of the traces left by other subjugation teams while tracking the magic beasts. The thinly cut wooden slips, like bamboo tablets, seemed to have been reused many times. There were marks showing that the surface had been scraped away and written on again. Of course, neither the wooden slips nor the paper documents had been written by the subjugation teams themselves. The guild employee had apparently made all of them. Scraping down the wood every time must have been work in itself. Guild employees seemed to have it quite hard too. There are no adventurers who write records like this. I have never seen one since I started working for the guild. Well, Hawan had expected as much. After dealing with them a bit, he could tell. It was not that adventurers' heads were decorations, but their brains were made of muscle. As he continued reading through the documents, something bothered him. But it was not clear. Hawan raised his head and asked the employee. Do you have a map of this area? It would be hard to call it a map, but we do have a simple drawing of the terrain. It is something the guild employees use. The guild employee rummaged through a bag and wooden box as he spoke. This area is close to the border, so the Margrave has forbidden drawing or selling maps. He is cautious about them falling into enemy hands. That will be enough. The paper the guild employee found and handed over had only simple markings showing the rough positions of mountains and villages. With a map like this, it was nearly impossible to know things such as the height of the mountains or the size of the villages. It really only recorded approximate locations. On that paper, Hawan used a charcoal pencil to mark dots. The places where the magic beast's footprints had been discovered. The places where witnesses had seen them. And the direction of the magic beast's movement, inferred from where human corpses had been found. The guild employee, who had been silently watching from the side, suddenly muttered, "Ah! One of them is chasing the other magic beasts. It seems that way." Hawan read the report again and sighed. All three looked similar. When he calmly traced their routes and the corpses left behind, one of them in particular had been killing people with extreme brutality. So cruelly that it made one want to look away. The guild employee glanced at Hawan, then looked back down at the map and murmured. Could they possibly be a mother and her young? Probably, yes. At the very least, they were definitely part of the same group. Seeing how crazed one of them was, it made more sense to think they were a mother and her young rather than simply a group that had been separated. Among animals, some grew to nearly adult size only a few months after birth. This was probably a similar case. He did not know how the mother and young had become separated, but more than half of the rampage was likely because of that. It looks as if this one hates humans. The guild employee spoke as if lamenting the fact. That is probably true. We do not know the circumstances, but humans must have caused it to be separated from its young. Hawan let out a small sigh and looked at the guild employee. Can you contact the other subjugation teams? Of course. It will take some time, but it is possible. It would be best to catch the young one first, then use it to lure the mother. If there is a team that has been closely tracking the young one, I would like us to join them. Yes, understood. I will contact them. Even if it was young, a magic beast was different from an ordinary animal. It was quite large, ferocious, and strong. It would not be easy to catch. Moreover, among the reports, there were notes saying that these magic beasts had continued moving normally even after being injured. They might be individuals with strong regenerative abilities. Hawan lowered his gaze back to the wooden slips and papers. He read them over and over again, familiarizing himself with the beast's behavior. Thinking he might discover something there, he stacked the words one by one in his mind, but he did not come to any major realization. That evening, several campfires were lit in the center, and almost everyone gathered around them to eat. The adventurers gathered for this subjugation were mostly 3rd and 4th rank. At this level, they were mid-tier adventurers with a fair amount of experience. Even if they were not used to hunting magic beasts. They had subjugated goblins several times before and each possessed their own specialties and abilities. If he joined forces with these people, they should be able to catch the magic beasts without too much trouble. Lizzie and Dorothy, who had been somewhat frightened at first, seemed to have grown used to them before long. They were dealing with the others calmly and properly. Once they were actually nearby, the adventurers seemed unexpectedly easygoing and approachable. In Lizzie's case in particular, she had begun to give off something of the air of a female adventurer. But Hawan did not forget that their easygoing friendliness existed because he, a man, was there. If Lizzie had been alone, things would not have been like this. The men who had threatened Red Sword every night had been the exact same kind of adventurers. Because they were women and a child in a party with a strong man, with a powerful protector, they could sit comfortably among these people and laugh. Men and women alike must be strong. Someone was telling a story from his childhood. Apparently, he had fallen into a pond and nearly died. It was not a particularly special story, but the gestures and expressions the man added every time he told it were funny. Lizzie and Dorothy laughed while sitting pressed close against Hawan. Now and then, one or two men's gazes drifted toward Lizzie. They were not looking at her openly. They only glanced now and then, and when their eyes met Hawan's, they quietly looked away. Lizzie was becoming more beautiful with each passing day. Even when he first saw her, he had thought she was cute and lovely, but now she was beautiful in anyone's eyes. It was like watching a caterpillar become a butterfly. Hawan placed a hand on Lizzie's shoulder and gently pulled her closer. Lizzie tilted her head and looked up at Hawan's face. Even that little tilt of her head was so lovable that it almost seemed intentional. A man sitting nearby was staring blankly at Lizzie as if he had lost his soul. Without realizing it, Hawan's hand tightened around Lizzie's shoulder. He had to stay alert. When people saw a beautiful flower, there would always be those who wanted to pluck it. He had to be strong enough that no one would dare think such a thing. Strong enough that merely looking at him once would make them abandon even the thought of fighting. Do not forget what kind of world this is. Chapter 125, Why does Dorothy look like Daddy? Life in this world began at dawn, or even just before it. By the time the sky slowly began to stain itself a pale ink color, Hawan and the adventurers had already started preparing for the capture. They gathered every net they had at the base and checked them one by one, making sure there were no torn spots and that each net was large enough to cover a magic beast properly. They paid particular attention to places that looked fine at first glance but felt weakened when touched. If a net was weak or snapped, then even if they managed to catch the magic beast, it would simply escape. Hawan and the adventurers pressed and pulled at the nets with their fingers, checking carefully to make sure they did not miss anything. The nets were not in terrible condition, but they were not good enough for capturing a magic beast either. They must have been used for a long time, because many parts had grown weak. Those nets were passed over to the group Lizzie was with. They were the repair team. They cut and patched the marked sections, and sometimes used netting thread to sew up holes. Lizzie was mixed in among the men, working hard to mend the nets as well. Dorothy ran here and there between the people, doing errands. She carried several large needles that looked almost like skewers, bringing them to whoever needed them, or hugged rolls of netting thread in her arms and toddled around with them. The work took longer than expected. Hawan had thought a few hours would be enough, but surprisingly, it continued even past noon. By the time the sun had shifted slightly down from directly overhead, a message arrived from another subjugation group. It seemed the group he had met when capturing Orthos, the two-headed dog, had almost reached the young magic beast. Hawan immediately led the adventurers toward the place where Gwen's group was. To capture a magic beast, they needed a certain amount of communication and a strong sense of teamwork. At the very least, they had to be coordinated enough to move together. Instead of riding in the wagon, Hawan walked alongside the adventurers. From time to time, idle chatter passed between them. There were crude bedroom jokes that could never be said in front of women, and exaggerated adventure stories full of obvious bravado popped up whenever the conversation was about to die down. It seemed that whether in this world or on Earth, the things men talked about when they gathered were pretty much the same. Seeing even the guild employee chime in now and then made it feel that way. It was not because they were adventurers. It was just because they were men. After following the guild employee's guidance for quite a while, they saw a single stick stuck upright in the dirt. It was not painted, but the top had been slightly burned black. The guide pointed at the wooden stick and said, "We can tell whether we're going the right way by looking for these. For the people following behind, we stick them into the ground whenever there's a fork in the road or a place where someone might get confused. However, carrying marker stakes around would become extra baggage. So instead, they used branches that could be found anywhere and burned the tips black. We copied the hunter's method. Instead of the marks hunters carve into trees or rocks, we do it like this." The guild guide grinned, pulled the stick out, and tossed it deep into the forest. He said that once the marker had served its purpose, they threw it away so that not just anyone could follow them. That was the rule. Adventurers make a lot of enemies, after all. If you're not careful, you die. Especially around here, since we're close to the border. We might even run into enemy soldiers. Listening to the guide, Hawan quietly walked with the adventurers. The Adventurers Guild seemed to take every chance it could to drill survival knowledge into adventurers. I make my living thanks to the guild too. When he thought about it, they really had helped him a lot. On top of that, he did not get the feeling that the guild ever tried to deceive adventurers. It felt different from other organizations. Maybe the true purpose of the Adventurers Guild was not prosperity or profit, but keeping adventurers alive. When he thought about how they assigned guides to new members, and how they taught even the smallest details whenever screaming carrots or magic beast carcasses came in, it really might be true. In a world where everyone ran after their own benefit, maybe only this Adventurers Guild had an altruistic goal. Thinking that while looking at the guide's back made Hawan feel strangely embarrassed. He needlessly rubbed near his eyes and looked off into the distance. The closer one got to the border, the more of Bern's territory became unsuitable for human life. The land was so vast that one end of the border was made up of endless forests and mountain ranges, while if one went toward the other side, dry land spread out almost like a desert. As if to prove those words true, the road Hawan's group traveled was quite rough at times. After passing along a broad dirt road, they would once again find themselves on a path overgrown with trees and grass. At other times, they walked beside a stream whose bed was almost exposed. As spring arrived, weeds had begun creeping out and taking over many parts of the road. Lizzie had become so skilled at driving the wagon that she handled it better than the coachman, but there were still roads troublesome enough that even her skill could not get them through easily. Sometimes the slope was so steep that if one stood still, it felt like they might topple backward. At times like that, the unicorn's monstrous strength was a great help. Yunhui was so strong that Huan wondered if she could still pull the wagon with that absurd power even if the road gave way beneath her. Every time the watching adventurers witnessed Yunhui's incredible strength, they clapped. And of course, bets followed without fail. The distance itself was not that far, but because difficult roads appeared now and then, they had to sleep outdoors for one night. From somewhere, the cry of an owl echoed. There was the moon in the sky and a campfire before their eyes. It felt as if they had stepped into a movie. "You look like your daddy." When Dorothy ran back and forth between the adventurer uncles, helping with errands, 1 out of every 10 people would inevitably say that to her. At first, those words made her so happy. She resembled the daddy she loved so much. Of course she was happy. But after saying that, they always added one more thing. "If you looked like your mommy, you would have grown into a beauty." Ha ha ha. Too bad, but don't be disappointed. Being pretty is nice, but being sturdy is an advantage too. She had heard that just a little while ago too. It was when she was going around giving the men small portions of salt as an errand for mommy. Dorothy lowered her head. She felt like tears were going to come out. Why did Dorothy look like daddy? It would have been better if she looked like mommy. Then she would have become an incredible beauty. As she trudged past the campfire, she saw her own black shadow. It was huge. It looked much bigger than Dorothy. It really looked like daddy. Not pretty. When she raised her arm, the shadow moved its pitch-black arm too, as if copying Dorothy. Suddenly, fear struck her. It looks like the shadow is alive and moving. From the back of her head, down her neck, all the way to her bottom, something seemed to slide down her body. It felt like something cold was running along her bones from inside her body. It felt as if her hair were standing on end toward the sky. Dorothy began running toward Mommy and Daddy, who were sitting a little distance away. The shadow chased right beside her. Ounce's shadow above her head was chasing Dorothy too. Wah! Before she knew it, she burst into tears. Startled, Daddy looked at Dorothy. Today, Daddy's face looked especially big. Daddy's arms and legs were big too. If she grew as tall as Daddy, maybe black hair would grow on her chin and under her nose too. Because she looked like Daddy, her arms and legs would definitely become very thick too. Because she looked like Daddy. The more she thought about it, the sadder she became. As if being chased by her shadow, and together with her shadow, Dorothy ran wildly and threw herself into Mommy's arms. Mommy! Why does Dorothy look like Daddy? The arms Huan had spread wide felt embarrassing. At first, Dorothy had looked like she was running toward him, but at the last moment, she had thrown herself into Lizzie's arms instead. And for some reason, Dorothy was sobbing miserably, saying she looked like her daddy. She cried and cried, babbling something in a jumbled mess. Her sobs and words were mixed together so much that he could not understand her properly. Putting together the words he could occasionally hear, it seemed Dorothy was going to grow a beard and thick arms and legs. And for some unknown reason, a shadow was chasing her. He could not tell whether she meant it was a monster, or whether it was a shadow that looked like her daddy. What in the world does that mean? He had no idea. No matter how much he listened, he could not understand why Dorothy would grow a beard and thick limbs. Had the child dreamed with her eyes open or something? As Lizzie patted the child's back, she looked up at Huan. She had a strange expression. Her brows were furrowed, but somehow, she also looked like she was smiling. Seeing how tightly she pressed her lips together, he thought she was probably holding back laughter. In any case, Lizzie seemed to understand everything Dorothy had said. what had happened, and why she was crying. Hawan crouched down and placed his hand on Dorothy's head. There was no hat, but Ounce was clinging tightly on top of it. Even though Dorothy had run, Ounce had not fallen off at all. That somehow made Ounce seem impressive too. With the child and Ounce both under his palm, Hawan spoke as if soothing her. "Dorothy, it's all right. I don't know what happened, but there's no need to cry. I'm sure it'll be okay." Dorothy lifted her tear-and-snot-covered face to look at Hawan, then burst into tears again. "Daddy, it's not okay. Dorothy doesn't want a beard. Daddy is nice, but Dorothy doesn't want Daddy's arms and legs. Why does Dorothy look like Daddy? Dorothy wants to be pretty too." Dorothy knew that Hawan and Lizzie were not her birth parents. But for some reason, Dorothy seemed to think she resembled Hawan. How? Why? How had that happened? In reality, they did not look alike at all. He was Asian and she was Western, so even their bone structure was different. On top of that, he was a man and she was a girl. There was no way they could resemble each other. Besides, Dorothy was the cute type. Her facial features were gathered slightly toward the center, making her look small and adorable. If Lizzie had the feeling of a Russian doll or Elsa from Frozen, Dorothy was probably the Anna type. She also resembled Anne of Green Gables a little, though she had no freckles. He wanted to tell her that, but he had no confidence in explaining what Elsa and Anna looked like. He could not exactly say that Lizzie and Dorothy were similar types. Only later, after piecing the story together, did he finally understand why Dorothy had started thinking that way. It seemed to have been a shock to Dorothy, but honestly, Hawan felt a little happy. People must have said those things because they thought the two were biological father and daughter. If they had known in advance that they were not related by blood, no one would have thought they looked alike. Still, the fact that they looked like a real father and daughter made him feel bashfully pleased. And he felt a little frustrated that he could not make the child understand that a daughter resembling her father did not mean she looked like a man. Hawan, to a child, it's either this or that. Black is black, and white is white. Telling Dorothy she can resemble her daddy and still be pretty as a girl is something she can't understand yet. So it was all or nothing. That evening, Dorothy barely left Lizzie's side. Normally, she would cling to Hawan's arm at least once and swing back and forth, or be carried in his arms like a kangaroo, but she did not come near him. Hawan had grown a little depressed, and Lizzie tried to comfort him, but her words instead delivered a fatal blow. "I think she's afraid she'll look even more like you if she stays near you. She'll probably forget all about it after one night. Whoever told Dorothy she looked like her daddy, come out. Each of you gets hit once before we start talking." The next day, after traveling for about 2 more hours, they were able to join Gwen's group. Gwen's subjugation party was small. There were barely more than 10 people. Since they had been the first team formed, they had apparently left before enough adventurers had gathered. Instead, aside from Gwen and Jack, there was one more magic beast hunter with them. In a way, they were a small elite force. The magic beast hunter looked about 10 years older than Hawan. He had a solid build. Hawan heard that he and Gwen knew each other. However, the man barely spoke. He did not even exchange greetings, merely nodding his head. "It's not because he's especially uncomfortable with you, Mr. Hawan. He's just naturally quiet." Perhaps worried Hawan might take offense, Gwen quietly added an explanation. When Hawan joined them, the magic beast hunter left a short while later. It seemed he planned to join another subjugation party. "With you here, Mr. Hawan, this side has enough fighting power." Jack said this while welcoming Hawan like a dog wagging its tail. His face did not look like it, but his behavior was cute. After they exchanged brief greetings, they immediately got to work. Gwen led Hawan off to one side. "While tracking its footprints, we noticed something strange. But rather than explaining it myself, I think it would be better for you to see it directly. I'd like to hear your opinion too, Mr. Hawan. The place where Gwen's group had stopped was where the mountain range gently ended and met the plains. Gwen led Hawan to a spot where a branch had been stuck into the ground and trampled down, then pointed. It's over there. See for yourself. Hawan approached and crouched down. On the dirt, there were a few black crumbs that looked like ash. After judging the position and shape of the footprints, he smelled the black crumbs. This is... Hawan's expression changed slightly.